name is Ghazaryan. I'm a human rights attorney. I was asked to moderate this session. This session is about collection of evidence, a very important process when someone wants to take a case to international tribunal. I myself always face this problem because it's one thing to say a violation happened. It's quite different when you want to prove it, especially in international tribunal, where the standards are proved, the culture, and the other factors quite different from what investigators and prosecutors do at local level, at national level. So we have three speakers. Each speaker has 15 minutes. The first speaker is Mr. Gegham Stepanyan, the current human rights defender of the Republic of Artsakh. And then Natia Navrouzov, director of the League of Advocacy at Yazda, Erbil. And Mingo, partnership advisor. Eyewitnesses to atrocities based in UK, in London, UK. So each speaker has 15 minutes, 15 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes question and answer session. The first speaker, Mr. Gegham Stepanyan, please let me introduce Mr. Stepanyan. Like I said, he's a current human rights defender, ombudsman of Republic of Artsakh. And during the war, he was the chief of staff of the Ombudsman Office. And he was actually organizing the entire operation, all the activities of collection of evidence, mostly or at times under bombing during the war. So these are things that we all should know, the world should know. And he was so regulating the activities of fact-finding mission, and many young people were cooperating with the Defender's Office and using his skills as a specialist in international affairs. He was also holding contacts with international organizations, to bring this up to international arena and tell that war atrocities and crimes were occurring during the 44-day war in Artsakh. So, Mr. Stepanyan, please, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. I would prefer to speak in Armenian if you don't mind. So,
well, first of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to the CFTJ organization for organization of this extremely important event, and mention that this organization, right after the war, all this time, made big efforts in this very important work of evidence collection, and also helped us to develop skills among our law students in Artsakh and to create this opportunity to record the mass atrocities and war crimes committed by Azerbaijan during the war. I would like to speak not only about internationally accepted procedures of evidence collection, but more concentrate on issues and works that were conducted by the Human Rights Defender's Office of Artsakh, particularly during the 44-day-long war. And we're always following the international, if I say that we always follow the international standards in those procedures, would not be correct. Of course, we had a bunch of problems, and particularly in terms of number, due to shortage of staff or due to complications of those procedures and due to lack of skills. But I can state that our cooperation with Armenian Human Rights Defender's Office and with Mr. Tatuyan, we have carried out quite a big volume of job, and the materials that we have collected were more than enough to raise in the world the awareness of on atrocities carried out by Azerbaijan. Well, I would like to underline that our goal was not just to do investigation, just to record facts, to collect evidences. So we were the first instance of collection of evidence, and then the different international legal instances or bodies that are in charge of execution of justice or execution of investigations to pass on them. So we have collected evidences, and based on them more than 20 different reports were published, and we have one that we have jointly done with the Armenia's Human Rights Defenders Office. So, and they gave the whole picture, really, what happened during this 44-day long war, and what should be the reaction of the world, which unfortunately we couldn't see all 44 days. I would like to mention that this evidence collection, there was not a new process for the Ombudsman's office in Artsakh. We have done the same job in 2016. Of course, the scale was completely different, scale of atrocities and war crimes, but at least we had some experience. By the way, one of the most important functions of Human Rights Defenders Office is in the efforts to prevent those war crimes and atrocities is the prevention and awareness. So that's why these bodies, ombudsman's offices, they have to always do monitoring and always keep alert and inform all other relevant structures about the atrocities and war crimes that have been carried out. And I can say that Artsakh's Ombudsman Office has been carrying out this function for sure. In the latest fact, it was 2018, so it was published a report about Armenophobia in Azerbaijan. So we have collected all hate speeches against Armenians in Azerbaijan, the majority of them, and we have sent it as an alert to the international community that if there are no prevention actions, then Azerbaijan is going to move towards war, which will create itself new crimes and new episodes of genocide. Unfortunately, this alert that was disseminated by Artsakh's Ombudsman Office and also Armenians Ombudsman's Office and other bodies of Artsakh, it never got any relevant response and reaction from international community. That's why Azerbaijan had the feeling of indulgence, and that's why the situation got worse and worse. During this 44-day long war for our evidence collection job, we have decided for ourselves certain principles to follow. First of all, non-biasness, so in terms of collection of facts. So being human rights defenders office, we are like a public body. Our facts, evidences could be perceived by international community as biased because we are Armenians and we were recording atrocities committed by Azeris against Armenians, and in this regard we tried to be as non-biased as possible and to depict the picture the way it is. And so in this sense we have sometimes also we were coming across obstacles, and this is the reason that Artsakh's ombudsman Artsakh Beglarian has made public speeches and appealing to international organizations, inviting to Artsakh, sending a very clear message that if you have suspicions about our reports, send your professional groups to Artsakh for collecting evidences. Another principle that we followed, despite the shortage of stuff that we had, so we managed to visit the crime scenes and to carry out initial actions. That means taking photos, collecting evidences. For example, in Stepanaker, the striking of missiles, striking the civilian objects, schools, hospitals, etc. For us was very important that the recording crimes within 1-2 hours they should have been documented and sent and to make it accessible to international organizations. The third principle was principle of having addressed actions, because during the war there were mass-scale human rights violations, and for us it was very important to send really specialized reports. For example, children's rights violation reports should be sent to that particular international organizations. Now, as far as torture concerns, again, reports about that should be sent to those international organizations that are dealing with tortures. So we try to avoid situation that any human rights organization that is not really specialized in that field would not receive a non-relevant report. As far as the methodology concerns, mainly we were carrying out visiting crime scenes, taking photos and making videos, and collection of those photos and videos that were in circulation in social networks. So this was the main toolkit that we were using. At the same time, we came across a few obstacles. First of all, the shortage of staff was one of the obstacles, and we can say that field work has been carried out in Artsakh. So but the analytical part and the preparation of reports was carried out in the office of Armenians Human Rights Defenders office. In general, international organizations, in case of famous countries, they support human rights defenders offices to build in terms of capacity building, but so far we have never received any support in that sense. And even in issues related to human rights, we didn't manage to break the isolation so far. Now, another obstacle was that security environment that we were working in. So being in Stepanaker, which was intensively bombarded by missiles and by artillery. And so we had cases when we were doing some crime scene examination, we were hit by missile strikes. So, for example, 2 of our employees, luckily they survived. They didn't get killed because there was a missile strike at that time. Another obstacle is, we can say, the not really good level of readiness of the public sector. So in general, in different countries, one of the most important NGOs, the most important partners of human rights defenders are those NGOs who are specialized in human rights field. So in this sense, during the war, right after war, even today, Artsakh has very serious problems. And I think this conference and similar type of conferences, they have to really discuss the possibilities of activating NGO sector in our Artsakh. And as far as the most important obstacle concerns that I have to mention, this is our hard work with international organizations. Unfortunately, all our appeals, all our messages that were addressed to different international organizations no matter were they international government organizations or non-government organizations, they were not getting any relevant response. We're asking, send us your group of people for evidence collections in order to increase the awareness, but we never got any echo. Now, as far as the post-war period concerns, the activities in terms of evidence collection was carried out more efficiently. I have to one more time mention the efforts that was made by CFTJ organization, plus other members of NGO sector in Armenia, those NGOs that are specialized in human rights field also. I lost the voice for some reason. Can't translate because I can't hear what is he saying. So now, if you are talking about one organization, that would be much more call it collection of facts, not collection of evidences. So, and call it just fact finding, not investigation. So in order to join our voices, join our efforts, and to have some impact on prevention of further atrocities from us Azerbaijani side, so we have to first of all talk about the capacity building in Artsakh, both for Ombudsman's office capacity building and NGO sector capacity building, and we have to talk about responsibility, about the punishment. If the people who have committed those crimes are not punished, this will continue on and on. Like in 1.5 years after the ceasefire, more than 100 crimes have been recorded that were against life and property of people in Artsakh, their psychological health, their dignity, etc. So that means we need to move further to the next step and to hold responsible those people, prevent them to make heroes out of those criminals. So there are a lot of things we need to do in order to internationalize the events of Artsakh. Artsakh is getting further and further more isolated from the world, which is not in our best interests, of course. And while this conference will give us chance for networking, and I would like to appeal to all of you to make the voice of Artsakh more audible, more and to be able to break this international isolation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stepanyan. We'll have a chance to address questions to the speaker. I want to indicate that the difference between 2016 armed conflict and 2020 is that, in respect of data collection and evidence collection, is that in 2020 the state took over of the task of taking cases to international tribunals, which means that prosecutors and investigators were doing mainly evidence collection. In 2016, and I was involved too, the private groups were doing evidence collection. That required huge amount of resources and expertise that we did not have actually. And so if there are methodologies elaborated of evidence collection, then it's very important that our prosecutors and investigators, including those working in Artsakh, they really have these methodologies. So it's a question of approaching the state, but the question is whether the state would like to have been approached. So we need to test this actually. Okay, so the next speaker is Natia Navrouzov. Let me say a few words about Natia. She's doing a very important job. She's an I need to read, sorry for this. She's an international law attorney and director of legal advocacy at Yazda NGO. And she has helped to develop and execute a legal advocacy plan on the Yazidi genocide committed by the Islamic State of Iraq. And she, at times, she worked with well-known lawyer Amal Clooney. And she also has led the design and implementation of a database on the Yazidi genocide containing over 2,000 witness testimonies and data of over 100 crime scenes, including mass graves, captivity sites, and destroyed buildings. And she has also analyzed existing and newly collected data for case building and reports. Natia, if you want to take use this stand here, from maybe it would be more representative, and I'll take your seat there. Okay. Microsoft is on.
Just need to figure. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today, and thank you so much for the Center for Truth and Justice for inviting me. So as just mentioned, I will really focus on a specific context where evidence was collected and successfully used to bring perpetrators to justice. So my presentation will be divided in 3 parts, but wherever I go, I always start by explaining who the Yazidis are, because I think it's very important. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the Yazidis, but actually when the genocide happened, I was still a law student living in France. And as a Yazidi, I was just horrified how the first question the international media was asking when ISIS was, massacring people was, who are the Yazidis? Instead of saying, how can we help them? So this is why wherever I go, I give a very brief presentation of the Yazidis. So the Yazidis are an ethno-religious minority, and Yazidis believe in one God and 7 angels. The religion has its roots in ancient Mesopotamia, and because Yazidis are a stateless community, a lot of them, live all over the world, the main population being in Iraq, the second main population being in Germany, and there are actually a lot of Yazidis here in Armenia. I looked it up before the presentation. The estimation is between 30 to 50,000 of Yazidis living in Armenia. And Armenia has been actually a homeland to many Yazidis for generations. So Yazidis have been persecuted, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And according to our history, we were subjected to 73 genocides before the one committed by ISIS. We call them firmans because firmans, it's basically a decree that Ottoman Empire was releasing whenever they were making a decision. And when the decree was mentioning Yazidis, it was usually in order to attack them. So Yazidis assimilated the word firman to genocide. So I will start my presentation by explaining what happened in Sinjar, so in the northern of Iraq, on the 3rd of August 2014. So before that, let's just take a step back. Here you see, I don't know if I can, oh, I wanted to point. Okay, I'm not sure how to do that, but, oh, here. Okay, great. So here is Mosul, and here is Sinjar. So you can see it's very close. With the car, you can get from Mosul to Sinjar in an hour. And first, ISIS took Mosul in June 2014, then Tel Afar, which is another city that is very close to Mosul. And then from beginning of August, they started to go to Sinjar. So Sinjar is divided in 2 areas. You have northern Sinjar, north side of the mountain, and south side of the mountain. ISIS actually came from the south side. So the people from the north side had time to flee. So if you look into what has happened to the Yazidis, the villages from the south side were more affected than the villages from the north side. Unfortunately, when ISIS came, the forces that were supposed to protect the Yazidis, so the Kurdish forces and the Iraqi army, withdrew and left the Yazidis by themselves. Another factor why that can explain the the crimes and the quantity of the crimes is the fact that many neighbors from Arab villages next to the Yazidi villages actually joined ISIS. So we believe that, you know, there were like previous discussions and they actually knew what would happen to the Yazidis. So this is again a closer look, Sinjar Mountain here, and here north side of Sinjar Mountain, and here south side. Okay, so when ISIS attacked the Yazidis, again, they had a very specific plan. And what they basically did is that they started by separate the woman from the man. They took the woman and enslaved them, and the men who were above 12 years old. So, you know, according to ISIS, these men could not be brainwashed. So they were executed and dumped into mass graves. And currently there is an estimation of 80 mass graves in Sinjar. In total, we estimate that between 10 and 12,000 people were either kidnapped or killed within the first days of the attacks. And 450,000 people, so the whole population of Sinjar was displaced, and people had to flee and basically found shelter in the neighboring countries such as Syria, Turkey, but also, of course, Kurdistan of Iraq, which is very close to Sinjar. What is actually not so well known when it comes to the Yazidi genocide is that ISIS also targeted Yazidi cultural heritage. So ISIS, of course, destroyed churches, mosques, but also Yazidi temples. So there's an estimation that we have, which is that 68 temples and Yazidi shrines were destroyed by ISIS, really trying to target the identity of the Yazidis. And also ISIS tried to destroy, you know, irrigation wells, agricultural equipment, just to make sure that Yazidis, if they return, you know, they struggle to start their livelihoods again. So what's happening today? So today, around 2,800 Yazidis are still missing, and no one is looking for them except for their families. 200,000 are still displaced in IDP camps, you know, without knowing what to do, without knowing if they can return to Sinjar or if they have to leave the country. 130,000 actually returned to Sinjar. But a few weeks ago, there were clashes between the Iraqi army and militias in Sinjar, and 10,000 people had to come back to Kurdistan after going back to Sinjar because of these clashes and the insecurity. They had to go back to Kurdistan. So the situation is very unstable. And we estimate that 100,000 people, Yazidis, have left Iraq because, you know, no prospects for the future. And a lot of them went to Germany, France, Canada, among other countries. So it's in this situation that the NGO I work with was created. So it's an NGO called Yazda. And Yazda was actually established 3 weeks after the start of the genocide. So sometime end of August. And it was established by Yazidis themselves. So this is where I can see a lot of common history with the Center for Truth and Justice. And it was established by Yazidis who were at the same time in the diaspora in the US and in Europe, but also Yazidis who were on the ground in Iraq. So when Yazda was created, you know, the first step the members wanted to take was to rescue Yazidis who were trapped on Sinjar Mountain. You remember I showed you that between both sides there was the mountain, so a lot of people fled to the mountain and were stuck there for days and days. And again, this was in August, so it was very, very, very hot. So people, Yazidis in the US, went in front of the White House and basically protested and said, you have to do something. And if you have seen, if you were following the news at that time, on the 7th of August, the Obama administration allowed airstrikes on Sinjar Mountain to open a corridor so that Yazidis could flee and join Kurdistan safely. But of course, the mission of the founding members of Yazda didn't stop there because there was a huge humanitarian crisis. The whole population of Sinjar was displaced. People, you know, you have to imagine people arriving without anything, not even having the time to grab, you know, clothes or any vital belongings. So Yazda decided to, you know, become an official NGO and start humanitarian work. So So this is a picture of Yazidis fleeing when the corridor was opened. So Yazda has two main missions currently. One is the humanitarian mission, which is providing psychosocial support to ISIS survivors, livelihood projects so that people who return to Sinjar can have an income, education projects, and case management projects. The second big mandate of Yazda is legal advocacy and documentation, and this is what I will be focusing on. But very briefly, Yazda is today registered not only in Iraq, but also in the US, in the UK, Germany, Sweden, and Australia. And we have around 80 full-time employees and some volunteers who are helping our mission. So let me present you here our documentation project. And I think this is what's very relevant to the topic. So the documentation project is a project that was created early 2015. So again, very shortly after the start of the genocide. And the idea was to build first a historical record of ISIS crimes, because same as Armenians, Yazidis went through many other attacks and massacres, and none of them had been documented. So I know, for example, my ancestors were persecuted during the Armenian genocide, but there's not much documentation available on that. So we wanted to avoid this, and that's why we created this project in the first place. The second objective is, of course, trying to build case files against perpetrators and bring them to justice. And then the third objective is advocacy, raising awareness, asking governments to recognize the genocide. Armenia, for example, recognized the Yazidi genocide in 2018. So what are we documented? We are documenting three main type of evidence. One is survivors' testimonies. One is crime scene data. So we go to Sinjar and we document mass graves, kill site, destroyed Yazidi cultural heritage, captivity sites. But we also document, for example, propaganda videos of ISIS. You know that ISIS left a lot of evidence behind and is available on open sources. But sometimes survivors, when they escape, they are able to bring back pictures, videos, documents. So we also document this. So, you know, whenever we documentation is a very sensitive work, of course, especially when you speak to survivors. So we have now in place specific methodology. We were trained by lawyers. Also, as mentioned, Amal Clooney and her team are supervising us and making sure that we're following best practice and all the time apply the do no harm principle when we deal with survivors. So this is, for example, the staff members who are simulating an interview and, you know, just giving each other feedback. So what have we collected so far? As already mentioned, we have collected over 2,000 testimonies of survivors. We have documented over 100 crime scenes. And whenever we document these crime scenes, we take the GPS, pictures, videos. We also use the eyeWitness app that my colleague Maria will be presenting after me. And we basically share that data. So this is examples of colleagues. You know, here you can see a bullet. He's documenting that. Here you have a drone shot. This is a mass grave. And this is a person who witnessed what has happened there. So we interview also people on site so that they tell us, you know, what happened here specifically. So what do we do with all this evidence? So we shared with two main recipients. One is UNITAD, a UN investigative team that was established by the UN Security Council to document crimes of Daesh in Iraq. So we have an MOU in place with them. And whenever they need evidence, we go back to the victims, we get their consent. And if the consent is given by the survivors, we share the evidence with UNITAD. And then the second recipient of our informations are national prosecutors and war crimes units, especially in Europe. You know that many ISIS members actually came from third countries, European countries, Germany, France, Belgium. So these people, when they try to return, they are arrested and then there are trials happening. And because these countries cannot go to Iraq to investigate their nationals, this is where our role is crucial because we have the evidence and we can share it with them. So how do we use this report? Very briefly, I'm also mindful of time. How do we use the evidence? Sorry, we publish reports to continue to raise awareness. We have, for example, published 2 reports on mass graves, presenting our findings. This is a report that we published in 2019 on destroyed Yazidi cultural heritage. So it's publicly available if you want to have a look. But I really want to finish by highlighting, the success stories that we have, because I think this is also a message I want to give to you, a message of hope. I know a lot of you are either considering to get involved in investigating the crimes committed against, the Armenian population, or already doing it. So, for example, in Germany, we have been very successful, and we have so far contributed to the conviction of 7 ISIS members. And one of these cases was the first genocide conviction worldwide of an ISIS member. And this ISIS member was actually an Iraqi who pretended to be a refugee. And thanks to the evidence that we had, we were able to identify a Yazidi survivor who was enslaved by him. And we helped that Yazidi survivor to go to Germany to testify in this case. And, according to the prosecution, without this witness, the genocide conviction would have not been possible. So this is something that happened in September last year, and that, we're really, really proud about. And since that, we got a bit more attention, and we also received more requests of information from different countries: Belgium, Netherlands, Canada, the US, etc. There's also an interesting case in France, which is the Lafarge case. So Lafarge is a cement plant which was operating in Syria. And basically when ISIS came, instead of closing the cement plant, other companies just left the area because of the conflict. Lafarge decided to stay, and to be able to do their operations, they paid money to ISIS and other terrorist groups. So because of that, they are now indicted for financing a terrorist group, but also for complicity to crimes against humanity. And we managed to have survivors join the proceedings as civil parties. And, the trial is still ongoing, but we are really hopeful that, Lafarge will be convicted, because here what's interesting is that companies like Lafarge have actually money, that victims could actually get compensation, which is harder when you go against individual perpetrators. There are also other ongoing investigations in Europe. I will just skip that. I just want to finish with Iraq. So we are not sharing any evidence currently with Iraq, because Iraq has not codified international crimes in its penal code. So Iraq is actually carrying out trials against ISIS members, but only for membership to a terrorist group, and also applying the death penalty. So because of these reasons, survivors are not involved, and we are not currently sharing any evidence with Iraq, but we are doing legal advocacy in Iraq. We are trying to push Iraq to establish either a mechanism or incorporate international crimes within its national system, or both. And here you can see a meeting that we had with the KRG Legal Parliament, for example, discussing with them such a draft law. And this is, I wanted to also show you, this is a group of survivors we work with, because one of our values is that we should not speak on behalf of survivors, because no one knows better what they want and need than survivors. So that's why we have established the Yazidi Survivors Network. And for now, it's a group of 15 very, very strong women who we have trained on advocacy, transitional justice. And whenever we want to do meetings, conferences, workshops, we always involve them, and we always ask them for their opinion. The challenges that we have, I think a lot of them were already mentioned, but basically the fact that we are Yazidis documenting Yazidi crimes, it's very difficult, because we are very close, personally involved in what happened. So I would say whoever wants to do that type of work, always think about self-care. Take care of yourself, because there's a high risk that you get burnout at some point. Another challenge is that a lot of people want to do that work. So sometimes, we see other NGOs or other organizations also documenting, and we just want to avoid re-traumatization of victims and duplication of work, but that's still remains a big challenge. And then I will just, finish by saying the last challenge, which is that the Yazidi genocide a lot of attention was given to it and a lot of compassion was shown, but still when it comes, to taking concrete steps, the political will is not there. For example, Europe is still not repatriating their nationals. Iraq is still not establishing any mechanism. So there's a lot of compassion, but, not a lot of action. So I want to really finish here by saying that, you can contact me, please be in touch. I also would like to say that as a Yazidi, I feel very close to the Armenian population. I think we have a lot of common history and a lot of common suffering and resilience. So if, you need any help, I see a lot of students here, if you want some advice on what to do next, please feel free to reach out, and thank you.
Natia, and I'm really glad that my country recognized the genocide of Yazidis. And I'm proud that I'm representing a Yazidi human rights activist in the national court who was charged for so-called hate speech, but in fact, what he did was criticizing the government. So I really hope that when I see you next time, I can tell charges have been dropped. I think I'm very close to that. And we got really good, I think, some advice about methodologies like the principle of do not harm, or involvement of victims, not only of taking evidence, but also leading them throughout other investigations, like double checking the facts. These are really inspiring, and I think that we need to learn from your expertise. Thank you very much. Keep in touch. Okay, and next speaker, she's going to speak about very interesting thing. It's 21st century, about how to unite digital technology with court case and evidence. So let me say a few words about Maria Mingo. She's currently a partnership advisor at eyeWitness to Atrocities, name of the organization, based in London, UK. An organization working in the intersection of law and technology and supporting activists' digital evidence collection of atrocity crimes for justice. And Ms. Mingo has 8 years of work experience with NGOs, international and regional organizations, diplomatic missions, and election observations. And she also holds a Master of Science in International Relations and Diplomacy. Please, floor is yours. Do you want to use the stand too? Yeah, okay, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Let me just check this. Great. Thank you so much for having me here today and to be with you at this important conference. I really appreciate all the organization that's gone behind it, and I'm very happy to stand before you today. Just briefly, as already mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about the same topic, just from a slightly different angle. So instead of focusing on witness testimony, I'll be focusing primarily on audiovisual documentation, so collection of verifiable photos and videos. So just as a very brief context for those who haven't heard of eyeWitness to Atrocities, we're an NGO based in London. As mentioned, we were created by the International Bar Association, and we work primarily with human rights organizations all over the world who are collecting this kind of information. So we support them with the collection of verifiable information, primarily through the use of an app that downloads all necessary metadata that is unmodifiable, but also by maintaining then the chain of custody of that footage. So linking that with a digital evidence locker, and also by building dossiers and submissions to investigative mechanisms, we try to move that forward for accountability. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But first, I'd like to start with a bit of context. As everyone here knows, the proliferation of smartphones has provided many, many opportunities. It has meant that increasingly human rights activists and citizens have the power to report what's happening around them. It's meant that human rights defenders are able to collect information, but also share information in real time. And we've all seen footage arise, whether it's on social media, whether it's on important reports that have been highlighted. We've seen this footage about violations all over the world in different contexts. And the question then is, how do we make sure to use this for justice? How can this be used as evidence to lead to accountability? And that's really the question I want to talk about today, given that with every opportunity, unfortunately, there are also challenges that come with it. So photo and video has tremendous potential to serve as justice, especially as an additional piece to the same puzzle. So complementary to witness testimony, often helping corroborate witness testimony. And unfortunately, some of the challenges we see around that is that it can be edited, it can be manipulated. We've seen online images such as deep fakes. We've seen images that are claimed to be in one place, later turns out they were taken somewhere completely different in a different context. So it can be difficult to know how this footage was collected, and in that sense, its evidentiary value. So even though maybe if you took that photo, you know your footage is authentic, you know that it hasn't been modified, well, a court on the other side doesn't know this. So what that means at the end is that additional standards need to be met in order to be able to use this footage as evidence. And I'd like to make a distinction here between using photos and videos for advocacy and using photos and videos for accountability. Both very, very important, but they come with different standards that need to be met. What can be used for advocacy cannot necessarily be also used for accountability. So that's where I'd like to start, given that if you record information at the higher level, at the higher standard, you can also use it for advocacy, not to say that that is in any way less meaningful, but just to say that the standards that need to be met are lower. So if you collect at a lower standard, you're not necessarily then able to also use it for accountability if, for example, later on, any mechanisms were to arise or come up at a later stage after the footage was collected. And one of the biggest benefits of, as we were hearing earlier, one of the biggest benefits is that often this information can be collected long before formal or official investigators arrive at the scene. So that's that shift that we've been seeing, especially with technology, that citizens and activists are the first to record this information. So it's different methodology, different standards. That's really what I want to talk about today. So just briefly, given that I keep mentioning standards, so what are those? So for photos and videos to be admissible in court, and of course, every jurisdiction has slightly different rules and standards and jurisprudence on the matter, but there are certain norms, certain principles that are considered universal. And two of the main ones are that a photo, a video, or an audio file need to be both relevant and reliable. So relevance refers to the content of the photo. It refers that a photo needs to be related to the case at hand. It means that it needs to depict something you're trying to prove. So if you provide a cat photo, I mean, that could be cute, but it's not going to help you very much with accountability, given that relevance, it won't be relevant. However, the part that I really want to talk to you about today, given the role that technology can play in this, is the reliability. So you talk about a photo being reliable when the integrity of the photo is intact. So we're talking about where the footage came from. What is the source? Has it been modified? Where and when was the photo taken? So that specific metadata, so that information relating to the date and time. So that's something that technology can help with that. You don't necessarily need technology, but then there are additional steps you need to take. There's additional techniques that need to be followed, but technology can help with that. So we've seen over the last few years two main approaches evolve in the context of technology, of course. So the first that I'd like to mention is open source investigation. We heard that earlier also from our colleague, and what it refers to is the methodology that can be applied to authenticate and verify footage that is found online. So if you if you don't know who the photographer is, for example, this is footage that was found on social media, it's what techniques and methodology you can apply to show that this footage actually was taken where it claims to have been taken. So let's go forward. Just to give examples, that can mean using satellite imagery, for example, that you compare different satellite imagery to confirm a location. It can be doing a shadow analysis to understand the time and date of when the picture was taken. It can mean going through frame by frame of a video to really identify and analyze whether it was modified. It's something that, as we heard before, can be resource intensive, and it requires a fair bit of technique and skills. But it's something that we've seen more and more and more with the amount of footage that has become available, and simply because we are looking for ways to use that for accountability, for evidence. But what I'd like to talk to you about specifically today is the other trend that has evolved, the other approach, and that is controlled capture tools, or a control capture app, as is the case of eyeWitness. I'm not focusing on this because it's more important than open source investigation. I'm focusing on this because it's really our area of expertise, and I'd like to talk more about options there in terms of using technology to take photos and video. So what is a control capture tool, or an app, which in this context I'll use interchangeably? So control capture means that it's, in this case, an app that collects all the necessary information, so metadata, for example, automatically at the time of capture. So it means that if you use an application, often they will look like a regular phone camera, and you'll just take a photo, a video, and what it will do is in the background, it will download all the necessary metadata relating to date, time, location, and it will lock it in a way that you cannot modify it. So that's the main point. However, if you want to use that for accountability, because you can also use that for advocacy, that's fine. But if you want to use that for accountability, you need to make sure also that either through that app or yourself that you can maintain the chain of custody additionally. So that means maintaining a secure record of who's had access to that footage since it was captured until it arrives at a courtroom. So in, let's say, traditional practices, or even common depending on the context, depending on what the reasons could be for using or not using technology, what that could look like is if you're using a regular camera, say an SDLR, what it would mean is removing the SD card, duplicating it, locking it, potentially putting it in a sealed bag, that back in a safe, keeping a log of who has access to that safe at any time, whenever the evidence is moved. So it's really keeping a really rigorous log and record of what has happened to that footage. So I'm mentioning that just to say that you can do these things without technology. It's just that the methodology is different, and it can be more rigorous, especially if you have, as we're hearing some of the challenges, potentially shortage of staff, or potentially need for additional training or skills, as we were hearing before. So what are the main benefits? I've touched on some of these before, but just to clarify, so one of the main benefits is, of course, the automatic metadata collection, right? That in the background, you get information of date, time, location quickly, and it means that you can verify large amount of footage at the same time. So we were hearing before how one of the differences today is the scale of violations, and as well the amount of footage. So it's going through all that, and it's quicker, it's more automatic. However, metadata alone will never be enough for accountability, even if it is unmodifiable. So the second is, of course, that chain of custody is streamlining what is the verification of that photo so that it hasn't been modified in any way. And the third is that many tools, many apps can also come with security features. So just to clarify that no tool, no app will be ever able to take away all that risks that come with documentation. So of course, if it is too unsafe to document, you shouldn't rely on a tool like this to protect you. But what it does do is it can have security features to mitigate those risks. So at least making it safer to use a control capture tool, a specialized app, than using your regular phone camera, for example. So examples can include hiding the app icon on the home screen. It can include making sure that all the footage that is collected with the app is saved only within the app and encrypted and locked, rather than anywhere on your phone. It can have emergency uninstall buttons. So it can have different features to make it a bit safer, which is of course a really big additional value if you're operating in environments of high security risk. So there are several apps out there that you can use, but as I was talking about at the beginning, it really matters what you're using the footage for and in what environment you're operating in. So we heard from Gegham earlier that you were saying the bit of the security environments that you, the security risks that you face, and the different contexts in which you operate. Is questions also such as internet connection. You might not need internet to use an app, but you will need internet to download it and upload footage if it's tied to a digital evidence locker, for example. So it's additional logistical questions that come into play, but primarily the fundamental question will always be, are you using this footage for accountability, or are you using it for other purposes? So I see I have 1 minute left. So essentially just to say, it's you want to make sure that whatever app you do use, that it collects the metadata, knowing where that metadata, where that information is being pulled from. Is it from your device? Is it from satellites? Where is it coming from? You want to know that how the footage is intact and that it's not modifiable. That's usually through encrypting the footage and calculating the hash values, a unique numerical code based on pixels, and comparing it later. You want to make sure that the chain of custody is maintained. So these are all things to look out for when assessing what, if you want to use such a tool. And just to mention very, very briefly that, and I'll stay to the time, I hope, so eyeWitness provides an app precisely for accountability, with all the features that I just mentioned and highlighted, but also just to say that in addition to the app, what makes it unique is the link to a digital evidence locker. So if you upload footage directly from the app, we can safeguard it, maintain the chain of custody. And what we do is usually we work with partners, with human rights organizations who collect this footage, and it's then sharing the footage back with them, given that we maintain that database to maintain the chain of custody, but also with their consent, it's sharing the footage with investigative mechanisms, whether that's building dossiers or submissions to them. So if you want to know more about partnerships, whether you're from an organization that collects information or you know other organizations or activists who would benefit from this type of technology, get in touch. The app is completely free. Training is free, all the services with it. It's mainly to support that gap of investigators, activists collecting the information and investigators who could use it later on. I will leave it there given the time, but thank you so much for having me, and happy to discuss any practical examples or anything like that in the Q&A or after the panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maria. I heard that Philip Leach, the well-known lawyer in UK, took a couple of cases to European Court of Human Rights with digital evidence about the war in 2014 between Russia and Ukraine to prove that Russia had military presence in Ukraine. So would like to know, of course, what's the court's attitude, international court's attitude to this kind of evidence, because we don't have yet a signal that the courts accept them as a clear-cut prima facie evidence. So if you have any information about the fate of this experiment by Philip Lich, would like to hear about this. Thank you. Now the floor is open for questions. I received 2 questions on my phone, but before I repeat these questions, please, you may refer your questions directly to the speakers. Sorry? A lot more, yeah. Yeah, I'm still waiting with my telephone. Better that if you refer questions from the yeah, there are 2. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'll share. Sorry.
Okay, please. Yes, go ahead, please. Yep. Yes.
You want me to say it out loud?
Well, you raised your hand? Yes.
You said to raise your hand for fun. I'm happy to shout if people can hear me. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, there are mobile microphones there. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. My name is Kate Powers, and I am a fellow with CFTJ this year. And my question is about bridging this gap. We heard this really powerful presentation from the first panelist about the efforts that they're trying to accomplish, but some capacity building that they require, some assistance they need, especially when it comes to legal standards and some specialization in international human rights. And then we hear these great NGO representatives who are doing this amazing work. eyeWitness is one really good example of, wanting to make these connections. So I'm wondering, why have we not been able to bridge this gap? Are there practical solutions that you can offer to those of us who want to help in the audience of making sure that the people on the ground trying to do the work are getting the support that they need?
Whom the question was addressed to, Gegham? Mr. Stepanyan?
To anybody.
Okay, please.
After the war, several similar attempts have been made to use the possibilities of carrying out various trainings in Artsakh, and I'm sure that after our today's meeting we will stay in touch and trying to establish close cooperation in terms of experience exchange and capacity building. Actually, Artsakh has this strong need, and taking into consideration the very limited number of specialists, and not only in terms of skills but also in general in terms of the number of specialists, I would welcome a lot this opportunity to fill in the gap. The only body that takes actions in terms of evidence collection or that could propose any training courses on the international law is the International Red Cross Committee. And I will be very happy. At least I have 2 representatives here sitting next to me of other NGOs that could be helpful in developing our capacities in this regard. Thank you.
And I received questions, like I said, on my phone. I want to, say them. Question is to Natia. Thank you. As a stateless people, what avenues do the Yazidis have for prosecuting cases? Specifically, which venues, courts, etc., can they use to pursue justice?
Thank you for the question. So from our experience so far, we have been mainly supporting prosecutions in third state countries, so not in Iraq. As I said, there's no legislation in Iraq currently that allows prosecution for international crimes. So we focus on states that are actually doing something, investigating. And Germany is a good example because from an early stage, they started to investigate ISIS crimes. And also what's particular with Germany is that a lot of Germans joined ISIS, but also a lot of Yazidi survivors went to Germany later to receive psychosocial support and treatment. So investigators there were able to have access to victims. So in Germany, there were two types of trials against German nationals. So jurisdiction was established based on nationality, but also universal jurisdiction case, the Taha AJ case that I mentioned, the first genocide conviction. The person convicted is Iraqi, the victim is Iraqi, the crimes happened in Iraq, but still Germany was able to prosecute because of universal jurisdiction. So we use these venues. Of course, there's a lot of frustration. A lot of Yazidis are calling to the ICC to take on a case, but Iraq is not a state party to the Rome Statute, neither is Syria. And, you know, there's no political will for any of these countries to join ICC anytime soon. So that's why we do also a lot of legal advocacy so that in Iraq prosecution can be possible, we hope very soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Question to, yeah, please, go ahead. Mobile microphone, please. Yeah, the first line.
Very much. It's interesting what I heard this afternoon, and it's true that it's very important to have very precise, very accurate information concerning crimes which are at issue. You know that lawyer in general, jurist in general, is a very frightful man because he's afraid of not saying the truth. So he needs really very strong evidence. It's quite striking if you look at the last judgment of the ICJ in the case between DRC and Uganda. Even some parts of the mapping report were not accepted as evidence by the ICJ, which shows how the lawyers, the judges can be distrustful about some truth, so some evidence. Sorry. What I would like to say more, especially, is the problem of the lack of criminal provisions in the criminal legislation, in the national legislation. There's something I'm fighting against this argument in order not to prosecute people who are suspected to have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity. And there is a very simple precedent. It's the old case law after the Second World War. You can look at all the criminal legislation at the time, in the 40s. There was not one word about war crimes and furthermore about crimes against humanity. And in spite of that lack of specific provisions, in many allied countries, there were prosecutions for war crimes, and even, but it was less frequent, for crimes against humanity. So I think that, in fact, the real problem is to have a good pedagogical training of the judges in order to show them that, in fact, international law, international criminal law is a fantastic tools box, but they have to look at this toolbox. They have to take it and to go and see what is in this toolbox. If they don't do that, of course, they will say, "I know it's impossible to prosecute this person because it's not in our legislation." It's really, I'm sorry to say that, but it's stupid to say that this kind of thing after the precedent, after the case law, after the jurisprudence of the after Second World War. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to comment? Does anyone want to comment?
I will share that message with Iraqi judges. But yeah, I totally understand your point. It's really a lack of, behind the lack of legal basis. I mean, there are ways to be creative, and I think there's just a lack of willingness to do that.
One second. It's on.
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah,
it's
Yeah.
on now.
Okay, I was expecting a little light up here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, just to add that, no, I mean, I completely understand the frustration, and it's something that really differs from country to country and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It's something that overall, at least at the international level, we have been seeing slowly a bit of a shift as well in terms of resources available. And for example, when it comes to at least photos, videos, and technology, that's something that, as you mentioned, can have quite very often they'd rather say that's not admitted than dealing with all the technical aspects of it. I'm talking in a general sense that it can be just harder. But overall, we have had more and more organizations put out materials, things like, for instance, the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations that came out a couple of years ago, which is essentially methodology in place to help or provide guidance to do open source investigations, which more and more we're starting to see, again, at the international level, feed into investigations. And we've seen, for example, the International Criminal Court in the Al-Verfali case to use videos as almost the only piece of evidence to issue an arrest warrant, for example. And again, there for arrest warrants, the threshold is lower, but still, it's something that we're slowly starting to see a trend. And it's something that, of course, workshops on the matter, etc., are always really useful. But I get your point.
Thank you. I read somewhere that when the US Supreme Court judges were going to rule about the first internet case in the end of 90s, they had a training what is internet before they're going to rule what is internet and architecture of internet. That was the end of 90s. So yeah, judges need to be trained. Especially, that's why I asked you whether the European Court has showed already an approach about digital evidence. As far as I know, they're not really enthusiastic about accepting this kind of, but maybe more efforts are needed with these new technologies. Now a question to Gegham. I have a lot of questions. If international, Mr. Stepanyan, if international organizations wanted to visit Artsakh, what would you want them to do? What is your request of these organizations?
First of all, the international organization not only have to visit the Artsakh, but they also have to establish their offices, their branches in Artsakh. It's not just only a matter of one-time visit. I'm talking about the implementing agencies of UN and other international organizations. And if other human rights protection organizations would like to visit Artsakh, then at least I would kindly request them to visit the areas where people were subjected to various atrocities, to communicate with the locals, to prepare their reports, and to continue their activities in this regard in increasing awareness. And through their activities to impact decision makers. The isolation is so significant. Very often you face the following situation. They apply to us to get some information. We provide this information, and after that there is a clarification question whether there is any reference to non-Armenian source of information. So, because in order to be able to use this information without making reference to the Armenian source. And then we say, if you do not come, if you do not visit, if you do not carry out your activities on the ground, where this information shall be coming from? All these evidences and facts. If we speak about other international organizations that are not into human rights protection, then I would wish to address and to request for the projects for the capacity building of our civil sector to communicate with them to understand their needs. If we speak about international government organizations, then once again I would like to underline that they have not only simply to visit Artsakh, but also to have their representations in Artsakh. Thank you.
Our next question is to Natia. How do you deal with victims or witnesses who are afraid to speak for fear of persecution to those who still have loved ones in captivity?
So that's a really good question. So as I mentioned, we have procedures in place. Our staff is also trained. They were trained by Justice Rapid Response, by the Institute for International Criminal Investigation based in The Hague, and also we're engaging a lot with UNITAD. But first, the main point here is that the interviewers, documenters are Yazidis. So they know the culture, they know the context, they know what's happening, and of course they're very sensitive to the person in front of them. So whenever we conduct interviews, we have a whole process. First, the victim will meet psychologists who will do an assessment of their mental health situation. Are they able to undergo a long interview? Because some of our interviews take 10 hours, split within, different days, but it's still a long process. Once the psychologist gives us the green light, the survivors sit down with the documenters, which go through all the points with them, including risks that there might be doing this interview. And at the end, the survivor gives the consent to participate in the interview or not. So it's really up to the survivor. We are here to explain everything, including the risks, but then it's for them to decide. And of course, if they decide to participate and later on they face some threats, they can always come to us and we can see how we can help them. But our process is really about putting the survivors in the center, because it's their story, it's their information, and it's their life.
Thank you. Another question to Maria. Is the anonymous sociological research useful as evidence for legal cause? How do you use it?
Sorry, could you repeat? Anonymous what, sorry? Excuse me.
Is the anonymous sociological research useful as evidence for legal cause? How to use it?
I'm not entirely sure why anonymous sociological research is meant, excuse me.
And I don't know who sent the question. I have only
Could
the phone
anyone
number.
please clarify? I'd be happy to address the question.
Yeah, please.
Surveys?
Microphone, please.
Right.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Sociological research is like surveys that are mostly anonymous. They are not personalized, generalized data that gathered through sociological methods. Is it useful for legal processes?
I mean, overall, thank you for clarifying, first of all. Excuse me for that. So overall, information like that can be helpful to guide investigators potentially as to what to look at. In terms of it being used as evidence is something that the question is probably best placed for an investigator, for a prosecutor. However, what I will say, at least in terms of the anonymity part of it, for eyeWitness, how we deal with that is just to clarify that, for example, the app does not collect any identifiable information about the user. So we have no idea who they are, and that's for security purposes. So that's done on purpose. However, as I mentioned, we work in partnership. So if we have a partnership with an organization, for example, and they have multiple staff using the app, we know that they're part of the organization, but we don't know who the individual users are, and we don't need to know who they are. So that's purposely done that way. However, because of how the technology is set up, we can still show the source in terms of it being the app and how it's intact and not modified. So we don't need the names of the documenters, and anonymity in that sense is not an obstacle for investigations in this context. It's a bit different if you're talking about testimonies, if you're talking about other sources of information, and maybe Natia can add to that in terms of testimony. But at least eyeWitness works primarily on crime scene documentation. So it's not testimony, but it's specifically on, for example, it can be destroyed buildings, it can be mass graves, it can be a different kind of scenes that are documented with the app. But anonymity is something that's important. And there is an option to add an email, but we discourage that if we have a partnership, simply because we understand that if we submit any information to a prosecutor and it is used in trial, everything in the hands of the prosecution ends up in the hands of the defense. So that's something that is very important for anyone who's bringing their name forward to understand what implications there can be with that. And so for us, if we're subpoenaed by the prosecution to provide additional information and we hold any information about the users, that could be a problem in terms of security. So anonymity for us isn't a problem, but maybe others can add to that.
You wanna comment?
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think just to quickly add, I think, as you said, surveys can be used as maybe background information to understand the context and the views of a certain area. There was a big survey that was done, for example, in Iraq with the Iraqi society, asking them how they feel in their country. Do they feel safe? Do they trust the government? I think, maybe that can be used as background by investigators to understand the context. But I guess it also depends on the jurisdiction. For example, I know in France, the identity of the victims are disclosed within the case files. So the lawyers, the judges, the prosecutors, the defense lawyers know the identity of the victim, but of course it's not disclosed beyond that. There might be some leaks of information, but the information, the identity in itself has to be disclosed, and then it's confidential. But I'm sure it can be different in other jurisdictions. So this is really how it works, for example, in France.
Thank you. Now another question to you, Natia. Would you or your organization be willing to help train evidence gathering in Artsakh?
Yeah, I think I made it very clear. We're really happy to support. And I really didn't have a lot of time to go through the challenges, but I think there's a lot of things you can learn from us, because I think like many here, we started the collection of evidence in an emergency situation. So you don't think about data management, coding your files, securing them, making sure you keep a photo log and a video log. We're doing these things now afterwards, like, almost 8 years after the genocide has happened, but we learned a lot. And as mentioned, we have a database that was established, but that came later on. So yeah, of course, I will be happy to help. And my team also has a lot of experience. And beyond that, we have a lot of partners that have trained us, and we're happy, to put you in touch with them.
Thank you. And there are two questions, numbered 1 and 2, but I'm not sure to which speaker, but let me pronounce the question. When and where has open source evidence been used? Has it been successful? Second question, what is the go-to resource for open source evidence? Maria, yeah, please.
So thank you for that question. So as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing open source information being used more and more. It's funny because if you ask different investigators whether they use open source information, and if so, to what extent, you will get different answers in terms of what is meant by open source information. Is it, for instance, NGO reports? Is it satellite imagery? Is it different kind of information that you find and can collect online? So it's different. We are seeing it more and more. For example, at the International Criminal Court, we're seeing that more in terms of photo and video evidence specifically. That we're definitely seeing a big trend as well, and that's more what I can talk about more specifically. I can give us an example of because I mentioned during the presentation, in order to stick to the time, I am happy to address more practical examples in the Q&A. And one success story that I'd like to highlight, because it was really information captured since the beginning with the app and going all the way to a judgment, was a case in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, so DRC. And that was a case in 2018 where we partnered with organizations called Trial International and Witness, so not eyeWitness, but Witness. We partnered with them in order to train different human rights organizations on the ground in Eastern DRC who were collecting photos and videos using the app. At the same time, Witness was training them on techniques in terms of what to take photos of, for example, and Trial pushing it forward also on the accountability side locally. And what we saw was so footage taken with the app, in addition to testimony in other forms, was included in the trial, and it was photos related to, in this case, it was mass graves that were, I mean, it was footage taken in 2018, but it was mass graves created back in 2012, for example, so 5 years beforehand. And so when I was talking at the beginning about photos and videos taken in real time, it's not necessarily that way. It can also be after the fact, going into different areas and collecting information, and often to corroborate witness testimony. And in that case, that was a trial of crimes against humanity, and we had a sentence of 2 individuals. It was a life sentence that they received. That's to give one example. But additionally, I mean, unfortunately, international justice, as we all know, can take a long time. We've seen some milestones, especially on the universal jurisdiction side, but overall, it can take a very, very long time. So it's where you have dossiers and submissions and eventually potentially trials starting. That's something that we won't know until the trial stage whether information is included or not. So it can take a very long time to assess, but we are seeing more and more the reliance on, well, open source information, but also photo and video generally.
Thank you. And the last question, because we're going to have coffee break from 2:30 to 3. So again, to Natia, sorry for burdening you with questions. Is the cooperation between Armenian institutions and state and the Yazidi efficient against genocide? What and how can be done or improved?
I mean, I think the fact that Armenia has recognized the Yazidi genocide is already a huge milestone. You know, I know a lot of Yazidis in Iraq were celebrating that day when that happened. And there's a large population of Yazidis here, which are more and more active in supporting the Yazidis in Iraq. And actually, I'm not sure if it's the same in your context, but when the genocide happened, Yazidis all over the world were connected to each other. You know, I as a Yazidi from Georgia, I had, you know, knowledge about Yazidis in Iraq, but I had never met them. I thought one day I will maybe go and visit them, but, you know, it really brought us together. And same for Yazidis from Armenia. There are some MPs here in Armenia which are really actively, you know, pushing for support to the Yazidis. There was also a visit to Iraq from Armenian officials. And actually, if I remember correctly, it was last year that Armenian consulate was opened in Erbil, just to show, like, you know, cooperation and solidarity. And in terms of what can be done more, I think, you know, the reason why I come and speak at these events, of course, is to show solidarity, but also, you know, each of you going home can raise more awareness about the Yazidi genocide. So, you know, each on your level, you can do something and, you know, push your decision makers maybe to welcome more Yazidis from Iraq who are unsafe in their country. And I know that many Yazidi students, for example, come to Yerevan to study because they don't have access to good education in Iraq.
Thank you. I want to conclude by saying that as a long-time human rights trainer, my teachers taught me already that if you want to judge to rule on human rights cases. It's not enough just to teach them knowledge and skills. There should be also value aspects incorporated in knowledge and skills. So that makes difference, human rights from other subjects when you teach them. Unless the judges and politicians, they approach with value to the human rights, their attitude will not change. So it's about changing attitudes of judges and politicians to human rights. Simply knowledge and simply skills would not change attitude unless we approach with the value aspect. So when our speakers were telling us about their successes and procedures, formalities, this was all about value. And we want to thank you for your job that you did. And let's thank our speakers for their time and dedication.